Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Monday, September 8, 2025. First, Britt found herself trapped in a cruel paradox of time and fear, her body betraying her with each passing day as the illness coursed through her veins. The moments she once took for granted had become fragile, precious, and painfully fleeting. Every beat of her heart reminded her that the reprieve she had been granted was not natural, but rather the product of calculated manipulation carried out in the sterile halls of a laboratory. She was not merely a survivor of circumstance but a carefully engineered subject of experimentation, caught in a web of science gone wrong. Jason, with his relentless determination and refusal to turn away from the truth, had uncovered what Britt herself had been too afraid to face. Her very existence had been rewritten, sustained not by fate but by a grotesque design meant to control her life. Inside the cold and menacing walls of the laboratory, Jason discovered the horrors that tied Britt's fate to forces beyond her grasp. The rows of hidden research files and cryptic formulas revealed that her revival was not a miracle but a manipulation. Machines hummed with lifeless rhythm, cages of secrets waiting to be unearthed. There he saw the evidence that Britt had been used as both a subject and a pawn, her pain feeding into a scheme larger than either of them could yet comprehend. The notion that her suffering had been orchestrated chilled Jason's blood, but it also ignited within him a fierce resolve. He could not allow her to remain a prisoner of science. Among the stolen files, Jason discovered something that pulsed with desperate promise, a formula that could serve as the antidote to Britt's condition. Hidden within the maze of data and toxic knowledge was a cure, the one chance to sever the chains that bound her to the injections and the control of unseen hands. His heart pounded as he realized the weight of what he carried. In his possession was not only the possibility of Britt's survival but also the proof of the sinister design that had robbed her of freedom. To him, the formula was more than chemical compounds and clinical notes. It was hope distilled into its purest form. When Jason returned to Britt, his urgency was palpable. He urged her to trust him, to leave behind the nightmare that was tightening around her, and to believe that freedom could exist beyond injections. Yet Britt's mind was not so easily swayed. The thought of walking away without the medicine that kept her alive felt like inviting death to claim her body instantly. Each dose was a reminder of how fragile her grip on life had become, and the idea of abandoning it filled her with dread. Her hesitation was not weakness but an instinctive clinging to survival, even if survival meant continuing to be tethered to the very chains Jason sought to break. The weight of Britt's indecision fell heavy between them. Jason, hardened by countless battles but softened by his devotion to those he cared about, could see that fear was paralyzing her. He knew that the time they had was vanishing with cruel speed. The ones who had orchestrated her torment would not hesitate to reclaim their experiment, and if they discovered the formula was missing, both he and Britt would become targets of merciless pursuit. Jason's voice, steady and urgent, pressed upon her the truth that waiting was not an option. They had one chance, and hesitation could shatter it completely. Britt stood at the crossroads of despair and deliverance. Her mind flashed with images of what might happen if she chose wrong, her body failing without the injections, or worse, being dragged back into the laboratory and forced to endure even greater horrors. Her heart warred with itself, torn between the instinct to trust Jason's unwavering determination and the paralyzing fear of what might await her outside. She had been manipulated for so long that trusting her own choices felt almost impossible. Yet beneath the fear, a spark of longing stirred the desire to live free, and bound by laboratories and syringes, and shackled from the shadow of those who saw her only as data and flesh. Jason, sensing her internal struggle, pushed forward with the unrelenting conviction that had carried him through countless trials. He reminded her, without words but with the intensity of his gaze, that he would not abandon her. His very presence was a shield, a promise that he would fight every force that sought to chain her again. The danger was immense, but so too was the possibility of a life reclaimed. He pressed upon her the urgency of choice, the need to step into the unknown, for the alternative was nothing but certain doom. Every second counted, and Jason knew they stood on the edge of disaster. The air between them grew heavy as the decision loomed, a silence filled with the weight of impending consequence. Britt's chest rose and fell with an even rhythm, her body already weakened by the illness but her spirit still searching for the strength to rise above it. In Jason's hands was the path forward, but in Britt's heart lay the power to seize it. She could not be forced, only convinced, and Jason's desperation was clear. If she faltered now, there might never be another chance. In those moments, time itself seemed suspended. Britt's entire future balanced on the knife's edge of her choice, while Jason stood ready to shield her from the world that had stolen her freedom. The laboratory's shadow still lingered, its grip not easily severed, but beyond that darkness was the promise of light. Jason's plea was not just a call for escape, it was an invitation to reclaim her humanity, her dignity, and her life. Whether Britt would find the courage to take that step remained uncertain, but the urgency of the moment left no doubt. Hesitation could cost her everything. Second, Lulu stood at a crossroads in her heart, torn by the gravity of the decision she had to make. The return of Britt stirred emotions she thought she had long buried, awakening both her fear of loss and her instinct to protect her son Rocco at all costs. The thought of Britt being back in Port Charles was unsettling enough, but the idea that Britt might come to claim a piece of Rocco's life was terrifying. Lulu imagined countless scenarios where Britt might somehow take Rocco away, and those fears clouded her judgment, leaving her anxious and restless. It was not only about custody or control but also about the delicate bond between a mother and her child. Her fears found their sharpest edge when she saw the way Britt looked at Rocco from afar, a mixture of longing and regret clouding her eyes. Lulu could not help but think that Britt, with her past and the strange circumstances that brought her back, might try to reclaim a role in Rocco's life. It was a thought that cut deep into Lulu's soul, threatening the stability she had fought so hard to create for her son. Every instinct told her to shield Rocco, to keep him far away from Britt's shadow, but another voice inside whispered that denying him the truth might only cause deeper wounds later. In the midst of Lulu's turmoil, Dante became her anchor. He reassured her with steady words and calm reasoning, reminding her that Britt's return did not have to be a threat. He explained that Britt carried no intention of tearing Rocco away from his family, but rather a yearning to see him, to understand who he had become, and perhaps to find a measure of peace in knowing he was thriving. Dante's perspective softened Lulu's fear just enough to allow her to reconsider. He insisted that Britt's desire was not to destroy but to reconnect, and that shutting her up might only create more bitterness. After days of internal struggle, Lulu finally agreed to take a step she had resisted for so long. With her heart heavy but resolute, she allowed Rocco the chance to meet Britt face to face. It was not a decision she made lightly, but one born from the hope that giving Rocco the truth would strengthen him rather than confuse him. Lulu's presence remained close, her protective instincts on high alert, yet she knew she had to give Britt space to speak and Rocco room to listen. The meeting became a test of faith not just in Britt, but in Rocco's ability to understand. Rocco's reaction at first mirrored Lulu's anxiety. The boy's shoulders stiffened, his eyes darted nervously, and his words were hesitant. He was unsure of what Britt represented in his life, and his confusion translated into guarded silence. The weight of the moment bore down on him as he confronted the woman whose presence had been more a shadow of stories than a reality. For a child, the sudden appearance of such a figure was overwhelming, and his initial instinct was to retreat. But Britt, understanding the fragility of the moment, approached with care and gentleness. She spoke not with authority or demand, but with honesty and warmth. Her words were carefully chosen to comfort rather than overwhelm, weaving her emotions into a story Rocco could grasp. She shared her regrets, her struggles, and above all her wish to see him live a life of joy. Britt made no claim, no demand, only an appeal for understanding, a quiet request to be seen not as a threat but as someone who still carried love for him. As Britt continued to speak, Rocco's defenses began to crumble. The tension in his small frame eased, and curiosity replaced fear in his eyes. He listened, truly listened, to the sincerity in her voice and the truth in her pain. Though he could not fully comprehend the complexities of her past, he sensed the authenticity of her emotions. The walls of suspicion that had stood between them started to dissolve, allowing a fragile bridge of empathy to form. Rocco began to see Britt not as an intruder but as a person searching for forgiveness and connection. The shift in Rocco's heart was subtle yet profound. He no longer looked at Britt with wariness but with compassion, recognizing that her desire to see him was born not from selfishness but from love. This realization planted a seed of understanding within him, one that softened the sharp edges of Lulu's fears. The boy's acceptance gave Britt a moment of redemption, a fleeting glimpse of what it meant to be forgiven, even partially, for the mistakes of the past. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. For Lulu, watching the interaction was both painful and healing. She realized that her son's capacity for empathy and forgiveness was greater than she had imagined, and in that realization, she found a measure of peace herself. While her fears had not vanished, they were tempered by the sight of Rocco connecting with Britt in a way that was genuine and tender. In that moment, Lulu understood that her decision had opened the door to something unexpected, not the loss she feared, but the growth and healing of everyone involved. Third, Michael was standing at a dangerous crossroads, with suspicion closing in around him faster than he could manage. Drew's shooting had shaken all of Port Charles, and in the aftermath of the chaos, Michael found himself under a spotlight he could not escape. Every detail seemed to point in his direction, from his presence near the scene to the tense history he shared with Drew. Whispers of his guilt spread through the community, and Michael knew that if he didn't act quickly, the rumor would harden into belief. He was desperate for a way to prove his innocence before the weight of accusation crushed him completely. The only thread of hope he had lay in Jacinda, a woman who had seen him on the night Drew was shot. Her presence could have been the key to clearing his name, a living witness who could place him away from the crime. Yet, as Michael reached out, he discovered that Jacinda had inexplicably vanished. Her disappearance was not only baffling but also sinister, as though someone had ensured she could not come forward to testify. The absence of her voice left Michael exposed, and each passing day made the case against him seem stronger. With Jacinda gone, Michael turned to someone he believed he could trust, Curtis. Known for his resourcefulness and determination, Curtis had connections and instincts that reached further than most. If anyone could track down Jacinda and uncover the truth, it was him. Michael approached with both urgency and humility, laying out his situation and the gravity of the accusations against him. To Michael, this was not merely about escaping blame, it was about survival, reputation, and protecting the family he loved from the shadow of scandal. Curtis listened carefully, weighing the desperation in Michael's words. Despite the tension surrounding the case, Curtis found himself willing to help. He understood the stakes, not just for Michael but for the fragile balance of Port Charles itself. A false conviction would tear apart families, ruin alliances, and further deepen the mistrust already brewing in town. Curtis agreed to step in, offering his skills to track Jacinda down and uncover the truth about her disappearance. His acceptance was not hesitant but firm, signaling his belief that Michael's plea was sincere. Yet Curtis was not acting out of pure charity. As much as he wanted to see justice served, he also had his own struggles weighing heavily on his mind. He saw in Michael's predicament an opportunity not to manipulate, but to forge a trade of trust. Curtis reminded Michael that help often came at a cost, not of money but of loyalty. If Michael wanted him to devote his time and risk his resources, then Michael would need to extend a hand in return. Curtis hinted at issues in his own life that required assistance, matters too delicate to share widely but pressing enough to demand support from someone as connected as Michael. Michael, caught between desperation and gratitude, agreed without hesitation. He knew that Curtis was a man of integrity, someone who would not exploit him recklessly. Whatever Curtis needed, Michael would do his best to provide. This new alliance, though born out of crisis, carried the potential to reshape their relationship. They were not just acquaintances thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming allies in a game where trust was scarce and betrayal constant. Together, they began to strategize. Curtis focused on the trail Jacinda had left behind, piecing together her movements in the days before she vanished. Rumors, sightings, and vague leads all painted a picture of someone either hiding from fear or being hidden against her will. Michael, meanwhile, prepared to confront whatever Curtis might ask of him, determined to repay the faith being shown. Each step forward carried risk, but also hope, heavy possibility that clearing his name was not an impossible dream. The search for Jacinda took on new urgency as Curtis dug deeper. He knew that time was working against them. The longer Jacinda remained missing, the greater the danger that her testimony would be silenced forever. For Michael, every delay tied in the noose around his reputation, pushing him closer to being branded guilty without a trial. The stakes were no longer just about one man's innocence, they were about exposing a conspiracy that might stretch further than anyone had imagined. As Michael and Curtis pressed forward, their bond grew under the weight of shared purpose. Both men knew the dangers they faced, but both also understood that the truth was the only weapon strong enough to protect them. For Michael, Curtis's agreement to help was more than an act of friendship. It was a lifeline in the darkest chapter of his life. And for Curtis, Michael's promise of reciprocity hinted at new possibilities, a partnership that could change both of their futures as long as they survived the storm that was only beginning to break. Fourth, Portia had always been seen as a woman of integrity, someone whose life revolved around her dedication to her family and her work. But the night Drew was shot shifted something inside her. As Drew slowly began to recover, regaining both his physical strength and the clarity of his memory, Portia realized that the secrets she had worked so hard to protect were now hanging by a thread. Drew was starting to recall pieces of that fateful evening, fragments of conversations, glimpses of shadows, and names spoken in hushed tones. His recollections, though incomplete, were enough to threaten everything Portia had carefully built. For Portia, the danger was not abstract, it was immediate and suffocating. If Drew revealed what he had seen, if his words were taken seriously, then all of her carefully woven plans and carefully hidden decisions would unravel. Her position in the community, her fragile grip on stability, and the loyalty of those closest to her could all collapse in an instant. She could not allow that to happen. The moment she realized that Drew's voice could become a weapon against her, she began to turn her mind towards strategies that would ensure his silence permanently if necessary. And like others who acted impulsively, Portia was deliberate. She understood that any misstep could draw suspicion toward her, so she constructed her response like a chess match, several moves ahead of her opponent. She mapped out scenarios in her head. What would happen if Drew spoke immediately? What might happen if he hesitated? And how she could redirect blame if questions pointed in her direction. Every possibility was weighed, and every risk calculated. She would not be caught unprepared. As Drew lay in his hospital bed, his body stitched back together and his mind piecing together fragments of truth, he felt a sense of relief that the nightmare was finally beginning to lift. But what he did not know was that another nightmare was already being crafted around him. Portia, with her calm demeanor and calculated steps, was setting into motion a trap that would keep him from ever being in a position to expose her. To Drew, his recovery was a second chance. To Portia, it was a threat she could not allow to breathe. Her plan relied not on brute force but on subtlety. She knew that if Drew were to meet a sudden or violent end, suspicion would cast its shadow directly onto her. Instead, she aimed to manipulate circumstances so that his credibility would be destroyed before he could utter a word of value. If he appeared unstable, if his memories could be painted as unreliable, then his testimony would wither into nothing more than the ramblings of a traumatized man. It was a strategy of erasure without bloodshed, one that allowed her to keep her own hands clean while ensuring his silence. But Portia did not stop at discrediting him. She began weaving layers into her plan, anticipating every angle. She considered planting false leads that would cast doubt on Drew's account, fabricating evidence that would subtly undermine him, and aligning herself with allies who could speak against him at critical moments. Each step she envisioned was designed to ensure that when Drew spoke, no one would truly listen. The brilliance of her plan lay not in crushing him outright, but in slowly dismantling his power until he was nothing more than a shadow of influence. Meanwhile, Drew felt an urgency to tell his story. Each memory that returned fueled his determination to expose the truth about the night he was shot. He confided in those he trusted, unaware that the very people he leaned on might already have been drawn into Portia's web of manipulation. He did not realize that every word he spoke could already be monitored, twisted, and prepared for dismantling by the trap waiting in silence. His belief that justice was finally within reach blinded him to the danger that lurked just outside his hospital door. Portia, ever composed, moved through the days with calm precision. To outsiders, she appeared to be supportive and steady, a figure of strength in turbulent times. Few could suspect that behind her steady eyes was a calculating mind, already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. She did not see herself as cruel, but as pragmatic. In her world, survival demanded sacrifice, and if Drew had to be neutralized for her to protect herself and those she cared about, then she would not hesitate. The morality of her actions mattered less than the preservation of her future. As the trap tightened around Drew, fate seemed to align with Portia's intentions. Every passing day that Drew grew stronger was also a day closer to his downfall. He thought he was climbing toward freedom, toward vindication, but each step was unknowingly guided into the snare Portia had built. She had turned the tide in her favor, transforming herself from the vulnerable figure at risk of exposure into the orchestrator of a deadly silence. Drew's recovery might have given him hope, but it had also given Portia time, and in that time, she had crafted the nightmare that awaited him. Finally, Molly could no longer ignore the gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. Days had turned into weeks, and Rick's absence had become more than just a curious silence. It had become a void, one that consumed her thoughts and cast shadows over her daily life. At first, she had believed her mother's explanations, choosing to accept Alexis's reassurances that Rick needed time or that he was handling personal matters. But the inconsistencies in Alexis's words had begun to pile up, and Molly's sharp intuition told her there was more beneath the surface. What unsettled her most was not just Rick's disappearance, but the way Alexis seemed to unravel whenever his name was mentioned, her voice strained, her words hesitant, her gaze unsteady. That hesitation was Molly's turning point. She realized her mother was not simply keeping her in the dark out of ignorance. She was actively hiding something. Alexis's attempts to reassure her had instead deepened her suspicion, for Molly knew the rhythms of her mother's speech too well to mistake nervous fumbling for sincerity. This wasn't Alexis protecting Rick's privacy, it was Alexis protecting a secret. The knowledge hit Molly with a force she could not shake, and she vowed to uncover what that secret was, even if it meant confronting truths that might shatter her trust. Her first step was to retrace Rick's steps, recalling the last time she had seen him and what he had been involved in at the time. She remembered his cryptic warnings about dangers he was facing, whispers of people who wanted to silence him, and how unsettled he had seemed in those final conversations. The more she pieced together, the more the idea took root that Rick had not simply chosen to leave but had been forced into silence. It was not abandonment she was dealing with, but captivity. The thought terrified her, yet it also fueled her determination to keep searching. Molly began questioning others in subtle ways, testing how they reacted when Rick's name came up. Some looked away too quickly, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few offered words that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. The pattern was undeniable, people knew more than they were saying, and Alexis was not the only one. The silence surrounding Rick was not coincidence but design. Each evasive response was another thread in the web Molly was now certain existed, a web carefully spun to conceal Rick's fate from those who cared most about him. At night, Molly's thoughts spiraled. She imagined Rick locked away in some hidden place, cut off from the world and from her, his voice unheard and his presence erased. The possibility of his suffering tore at her heart, but the possibility of him being gone entirely terrified her even more. What if Alexis's evasions were not about protecting Molly from the knowledge of captivity but from the knowledge of death? The duality haunted her, making her investigation all the more urgent. She could not allow the truth to remain buried, no matter how devastating it might be. Alexis, on the other hand, felt her composure slipping with each day. She had tried to shield Molly from the darkest realities, believing that ignorance would spare her daughter the pain. But Alexis underestimated Molly's determination and her instinct for truth. Each conversation chipped away at Alexis's defenses, leaving cracks in the carefully constructed wall of silence she had built. The more Alexis denied, the more obvious it became that she was hiding something monumental. What she feared most was the moment Molly connected the final dots and realized her own mother had been complicit in keeping Rick hidden from her. The tension between mother and daughter grew unbearable. Molly's questions became sharper, her silences heavier, and Alexis could feel her daughter's gaze dissecting every word she spoke. Their once warm exchanges were now laced with mistrust, with Molly searching for lies and Alexis scrambling to cover them. What had once been a relationship grounded in openness was now fraying at the edges, and raveling under the weight of secrets too heavy to hold. Alexis wanted to protect Molly, but in doing so, she had created a wound that might never heal. Molly began her own private search, combing through records, messages, and fragments of information that others might have overlooked. Each small discovery only deepened her certainty Rick had not left by choice. There were forces at play, darker than she had imagined, and Alexis was tied to them in ways Molly could not yet fully understand. Her investigation became not only about finding Rick but about uncovering the truth behind Alexis's silence. What Molly feared most was not just losing her father, but losing her mother's trust forever. In the end, Molly's determination stood in stark contrast to Alexis's fear. One was driven by love and the refusal to accept silence as an answer, while the other was shackled by the weight of secrets and the desperate hope of protection. Their paths were colliding, and the truth was poised to erupt between them. Molly's pursuit of Rick was no longer just about locating a missing father, it was about unmasking the hidden shadows in her own family and confronting the betrayal she sensed. Lingering in every hesitant word Alexis spoke. The storm was coming, and neither mother nor daughter could avoid its force.